Welcome to the Chesapeake Capital monthly video series entitled Asking for a Friend. I'm your host, Eric Jefferson, and this month we're going to focus on a recent theme that's gained a lot of traction post-pandemic. That is reshoring, or companies bringing previously outsourced jobs, typically those very manufacturing and labor intensive, those that have been shipped overseas to take advantage of lower labor costs, now coming back to U.S. shores. I'm going to go through not only what it is, some of the benefits, but also look at the flip side of that coin, some of the hidden implications associated with this that may not necessarily make the headlines. Now, before we get started, have a few quick words from our legal team. With that, we can begin. As we do, like to start by first defining reshoring. As I mentioned, this is the process of bringing previously outsourced jobs back to the United States. And as we think about how this has really evolved, if we go back to the pandemic, one of the many casualties, in addition to all of the health implications, were global supply chains. You saw shoe companies that had outsourced manufacturing to China, saw those production facilities shut down. Now they're left with no products to sell. In a similar vein, you saw auto companies watch tens of thousands of finished automobiles sit on their lots waiting for microchips before they could be sold. And so, in the aftermath of the pandemic, as companies began to reevaluate their production strategies, we've seen an increasing trend of more and more bringing those manufacturing, labor intensive jobs back to the United States. Now, not surprisingly, companies that have done this have received quite a bit of praise, both from politicians locally and at the national level, as well. You see that reflected in their stock price. Not surprisingly, the number one benefit of this is the local economy. You now have more U.S. jobs, more tax revenue paid from those, as well from the company's standpoint. First and foremost, have a more simplified supply chain. Your inventory no longer at the mercy of a foreign entity. As well, when you think about previously creating goods overseas, then having to ship them, you're now going to save those transportation costs, as well, likely make that process much faster. We think back to the pandemic. There was the LA port that had those significant backlogs, which in turn created a shortage of many physical goods. Lastly, in all cases, likely expect a more consistent production standard. That's a function of goods now being manufactured in a country, in a region with a higher, more strict regulatory environment. Can also think about having workers that now speak the same language, operate in the same time zone, all else being equal, likely have a positive benefit on overall production. And rightfully so, companies have received a lot of praise and seen their stock prices benefit from doing this. But as we peel back some of the layers, not necessarily as rosy across the board as the headlines may suggest. First and foremost, when we think about the geopolitical front, if you have two nations that have a very intertwined economy, do a lot of trade, have a lot of back and forth, those countries less likely to go to war with one another. All else being equal, if we see that economic relationship weaken, that could potentially open the door to a less stable relationship. Granted, individual companies' focus tends to be on their product, their service, and as we think about costs associated with bringing those jobs back, first and foremost, are those startup costs to build the physical manufacturing hubs here on U.S. borders or within U.S. borders. Within that, you now also have to go out and train new employees how to do it. But the key piece here I want to focus on is the labor availability, particularly at a specific wage. And go through an example that may illustrate the hidden costs associated with bringing some of these jobs back and the inflationary element that may ultimately have. So to set the stage, here on the screen we have minimum wage. First in Beijing, China, the local currency equivalent $3.70 an hour. That rate is up meaningfully from what it's been over the last several decades. In the U.S., federal minimum wage of 7.25. Granted, many individual states have a much higher rate. And as we think about the implications here, for companies that produce physical goods that are very labor intensive, labor is obviously a much larger cost to produce that item to ultimately bring it to market. If those costs doubles, companies are now forced to do one of two things: absorb that and have that negatively impact their profit margins, or ultimately pass that along to the consumer, which in turn has an inflationary element to it. So I want to share a hypothetical example to bring this to light. Let's say we have a company that sells a product, a widget, for $35. If they're manufacturing it overseas, it requires $12 of materials, 3 hours of unskilled labor. That costs $3 to ship it across the globe, and then $2 in administrative costs. If we go through and do up all the math using that $3.70 an hour rate, the all-in cost to produce this, less the $35 sale price, creates a profit margin of $6.90. That's a very healthy margin. That's one where companies are going to continue to grow and grow. But let's go through this example and all of a sudden assume these products are now being manufactured domestically. Companies are going to save the $3 or see a very meaningful reduction in transportation costs, but unfortunately that's going to be more than offset by the increase they now pay for labor. That cost is going to more than double and in turn eat up all of those profit margins. Going through doing the math in that second example, company would actually lose 75 cents per unit. Now that's a problem for two reasons. First being, companies that lose money don't tend to stay in business. And so one of two things needs to happen. They need to adjust their market, think about what items they're going to continue to produce, or secondly, they need to pass those higher costs along to their end consumers. That's the trend that we've seen take place as of late. And in turn, that further fuels this cycle of inflation. Higher end prices for goods obviously have an upward impact on inflation. But as we also think about more jobs coming to the US, as the current dynamic of labor, we have more open positions versus unemployed workers looking to work. As a result, that puts upward pressure on wages. And so we think about how this all plays out at a time where the Federal Reserve is trying to combat inflation, get it back down to the long-term average of 2%. We're seeing companies pay more for wages and then in turn increase the price of their end products. Both of those forces obviously increase inflation as in direct contrast to what our Federal Reserve is ultimately trying to do. Again, some inflation, certainly healthy for an economy. Granted, 2% is somewhat of an arbitrary number, but when you think about the implications of inflation long term, controlling that, absolutely a critical effort. And think about the recent trends with respect to reshoring, in many ways goes against what we are trying to do for the long-term benefit of our economy. That's all for this month, but I appreciate you taking the time to tune in as well. You have my email there. Please don't ever hesitate to reach out with a topic you'd like to see for future installments. Thank you again for your time.